Correct. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lakeisha. Welcome to the joint GCP conference by the US FDA, MHRA UK, and Health Canada on GCP and pharmacovigilance compliance. And my name is Kassa Ayalew, as Lakeisha introduced, and I am from the US FDA. And the session that I will be moderating will be on GCP harmonization updates. And this session will be providing you an overview on ICH 6 revision, including discussion on GCP principles and providing you an overview on highlights that have been revised in ICH 6, as well as also timelines and the status on ICH 6 guideline, which is currently the Annex 1 is on the draft and published last year. And we'll be also touching upon Annex 2, and as Dr. Cavazzoni stated, that is additional consideration on conducting interventional clinical studies using decentralized elements and real-world data, as well as those that contains pragmatic features. And I have three speakers with me, and the first speaker is Leigh Marcus. Leigh Marcus is a senior physician from the US FDA, followed by, and Leigh Marcus is to my right, and to her right is Hocine Abid from Health Canada. Hocine is the regulatory, the national manager from Health Canada, and as well as Andrew Fisher to the most right, who is a lead senior GCP inspector from MHRA UK. I'm going to, before I call Leigh Marcus to come to the podium to present her presentation, I'm going to mention that most of you have already submitted several questions through the online form, and we're going to identify those questions relevant to the session, and we'll be addressing during the Q&A. But I want to encourage you to continue submitting your questions during this session. Thank you very much, and I'm going to call to my colleague Leigh Marcus to come to the podium. Leigh?
Great, thanks so much. Okay. All right, so I'll start us off. Thanks so much for having us today. We're very excited to give you the ICH E6R3 Good Clinical Practice Draft Guideline updates. This is our disclaimer, and then we'll talk about the overview here. I'm just gonna queue all of them up together. Okay, so I'll start the talk off and discuss the basis for the ICH updates, the historical context, the status of the updates, and the future timeline. I'd like to highlight areas that have been updated or changed from its predecessor, ICH E6R2. Together with my colleagues at MHRA and Health Canada, we'll provide an overview of the draft clinical practice principles and Annex 1 guideline. Then I'll turn the mic over to Dr. Abid at Health Canada to discuss sponsor and investigator responsibilities that have been updated. Then our regulatory counterpart, Andy Fisher at MHRA, will cover inquiries from the MHRA survey, significant changes, including data governance and essential documents. And then I'll grab the microphone back and discuss plans for Annex 2. Okay, so I'll start off with the general overview and history. So in this session, we will be discussing the third revision of the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements, so ICH, for pharmaceuticals for human use, E6 guidelines. That's an internationally recognized standard of good practice for the entire clinical trial lifecycle, from design and conduct to monitoring, recording, and reporting. The first version of E6 guideline was finalized in 1996, which you can see in the top half here, describe responsibilities and expectation of stakeholders in the conduct of clinical trials. It covered aspects of what I just talked about, the monitoring, reporting, and included sections for essential documents and IBs. The second version finalized in 2016, which this is all pre-pandemic, right? Like who remembers this part? But I'll remind you, that was the E6R2, and that included the integrated addendum, and it also encouraged implementation of improved and efficient approaches to GCP, also protected human subjects, and updated some standard for electronic records, which we were sort of getting into at that time. Then in 2017, stakeholders like you conveyed concerns that the current ICH E6R2 guideline failed to sufficiently recognize variations in the level of risk for participants in different types of trials and allow for corresponding flexibility. I always joke that the F in FDA is for flexibility. That's why we're here to talk about it. So there was issues with managing the risks, and you can read this in the reflection paper if you haven't already on the right panel, and there's a link to it at the bottom. You guys are going to get all these slides. Another major concern related to E6R2's limited scope, it felt that anything titled good clinical practice should actually holistically address the planning of the conduct of the clinical trials, not just when it's already on paper and being put into humans. So the goal of the renovation that we're going to talk about is to provide an updated guidance that's both appropriate and flexible, that F word again, to address the increasing diversity of study types and data sources that are being employed to support regulatory and other health policy decisions. I want to note again that the underlying principles of this guideline for human subject protection and data quality is obviously going to remain. That's important. And the take home for me is noting that they're identified a need to make a change. And it was the ICH's decision to invite stakeholder comments, like you guys, on the proposed revisions in an early stage ahead of even developing the effort in changing it. And it invited public comment, which we'll talk about in a few, and it recognizes that the considerable stake and relevant expertise in the research community is there beyond just ICH. So I thought it's more of like a kumbaya moment, okay? Remember kumbaya around the campfire? We're getting everybody together to invite everybody worldwide to comment on the failing of this E6R2 guideline and how to make it better and how to make it change for the better for R3. Okay. So let's take a look back before we can look forward. There is a need for improvement with E6R2. After hearing general concerns that E2 had an issue, there was a subsequent gap analysis and there was stakeholder comment analysis to take a look at this. So on the left, you'll see it was comprised of published articles, academic responses. There was an open letter to EMA and the ICH. There were responses in something called the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. So you'll hear city survey thrown around. There was input from public engagement, and there was interviews on informing the renovations of the ICH E6 project. So the guideline analysis of all the guidelines concluded that even though E6R2 is intended for clinical trials to support registration and, hopefully approval of these drugs, it was also widely applied to other types of clinical trials that didn't necessarily need it. So the thought that E2 guidance had more of a one-size-fits-all approach, and there were concerns about those clinical trials to meet the GCP requirements in different situations, like during a public health crisis, like we just went through with COVID-19. There were concerns that the GCP requirements were being applied where it's not applicable, and we really needed to accommodate the changing clinical trial landscape. So the ICH E6R3's updated purpose was to provide guidance that's applicable to different trial designs and facilitate innovation. So I like these three words: modernize, harmonize, and adapt to currently accepted best practice. So the R3 guideline is entailed of 11 core principles of good clinical practice, which Dr. Abid will go over. And it's actually 2 fewer than its predecessor in R2. But then you get these bonus 2 annexes, which will replace some of the previous addendum of R2. I'd say it's a refinement and not a total overhaul, so don't get too nervous. The purpose of R3 is really to keep pace and fully satisfy the regulatory demands of the latest clinical trial innovations globally, focus on appropriate quality by design, proportionate and risk-based approach, which we heard previously with Dr. Cavazzoni speak about, and also to approach the design and conduct of the clinical trial. So even before, again, it goes into humans. Lastly, it should address the complexities of clinical trials and the current regulatory climate, such as encouraging the exploration of technology. We'll hear later this week about digital health technology. It should encourage engagement and inclusivity, such as decentralized trials as well. You'll hear later about that. I also wanted to touch base on just the development of R3 before we even, put it into a draft guidance. So first, in the red, you'll see there was engagement with academic stakeholders and a series of joint meetings with an expert working group. Next, in this coral shade, there was some new approaches to enhance transparency, such as sharing the updated draft principles that were published in April of 2021 and endorsed by the ICH in May in 2023. And then there were public web conferences held over two days in May of 2021 to provide updates to the development. And lastly, in the lighter blue, there is going to be extensive training material planned to be developed with use cases so that you can bring them back to, the employees in your group. They'll be used there to clarify and provide supplemental explanation to the application of the new GCP guidelines. And therefore, expert working groups within agencies and between agencies assured internal clearances and external clearances of the material, and then final endorsement by the ICH. So there was a change in guideline structure in addition, which included, again, the Annex 1 and Annex 2. So this is just, sort of your cliff notes for the overarching updated guidelines. So Annex 1 was considerations for interventional trials, in which a draft was already published, and we saw on the previous slide, and Dr. Abid and Andy Fisher will touch on those highlights. And then Annex 2 has guidelines on varied clinical trial types, like non-interventional trials, which I'm happy to talk about in a break. I can talk about for days. I sort of love them. Data sources, there's a section on data governance, and when complete, the E6R3 will be comprised of the overarching principles and objectives, the Annex 1 and the Annex 2. The Annex 2 concept paper was written in March of 2023 and endorsed by the ICH E6R3 Expert Working Group Annex 2 subgroup. Try saying that 5 times fast. It's a lot, but there's a subgroup and an expert working group. It was established to begin development of Annex 2, which we are in the middle of developing. We expect about 1 year to 18 months needed to develop the draft, and then it will be out for public consumption. I'll chat more about this after the next 2 presentations. I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Abid from Health Canada.
Thank you very much, Leigh. So in the next slides, I'm going to cover some of the key changes that we all will see in the new version, R3. So we'll cover the principles and the responsibilities in relation to the sponsor and the investigator. So ICH E6 R3 is composed of overarching principle and annexes, as Leigh has explained. So the principles are designed to be flexible and applicable to a broad range of clinical trials. Annex 1 provides information on how these principles can be applied to clinical trials. And Annex 2 is suitable and adjusted for a variety of trial designs and set and data sources, particularly decentralized clinical trial, pragmatic element, real-world data, and digital health technologies. In this slide, I try to provide an illustration on the changes to the contents. As you can see, nothing is lost. Everything is there. Of course, we have a new section, is data governance, section 4. And of course, there is a rearrangement. What was section 6, 7, and 8, respectively, clinical trial, investigator brochure, essential document, are now appendices in the new version. So principle of ICH GCP. They are overarching principle that provide a flexible framework for the ethical conduct of clinical trial. So these principles are intended to apply across a variety of clinical trial types and settings and to remain relevant for advances in technology and methodologies. Of course, ICH E6R3 will provide flexibility how to meet and how to satisfy these principles. Stakeholders or clinical trial stakeholders will have all of the flexibility. So the key changes, not all of them. So first of all, these principles are interdependent and interconnected and should be considered in their totality to assure an ethical clinical trial conduct and reliable results. So just to compare these principles in R3 version and R2 version. So in R2 version, we have 13 statements. In R3, we will have 11 big statements, but under each of these statements, we will have sub-statement or sub-bullet or sub-point, name it the way you want. And I counted about 40 of these sub-statements. So 40 sub-statements with 11, overarching principle, that's 51 compared to only 13 in R2. This not to make our life difficult or complex, it's more to provide clarity and flexibility. So I'll go with principle 1. This is like the usual, clinical trial should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principle that have their origin in Declaration of Helsinki. So clinical trial should be consistent with GCP and regulatory requirement with the ultimate objective to ensure the right, the safety, and the well-being of participants. So highlighted in yellow is cross-reference to the principle stated in R2. So even if you don't see these statements in the big principles, you will see them in the sub-point. I can't cover all of these in 18 minutes. I think it takes more than half a day or 1 day to cover all of these changes, but I will do my best. Informed consent is still the cornerstone. Nothing changed there. Principle 3, 4, 5, straightforward, like independent review of the institutional review board or the independent ethics committees. Clinical trials should be scientifically sound for their intended purpose. And principle 5, provide more flexibility. Clinical trials should be designed and conducted by qualified individuals. Now, the principle 6 introduced the quality concept. So quality should be built into the scientific and operational design, as well as the conduct of the clinical trial. Principle 7 is a new principle. It introduces the proportionate risk approach. So process, measures, and approaches for clinical trials should be implemented, taking into consideration a proportionate risk to participant and to important element of the data, but also to quality. If we go to principle 8 and 9, straightforward, clarity about the clinical trial protocol and the plans and the implementation. 9 is about clinical trials should generate reliable results. It's all about systems and procedures that should secure or assure the quality of every aspect of the design and the conduct of clinical trial. Number 10, most important, is a new principle. Roles and responsibilities in clinical trials should be clearly documented. More details in the sub-statements. And principle 11 is about the investigational product that should be manufactured in accordance with the good manufacturing practices, GMP, but also the storage, the shipping, the handling, and the disposal of these investigational products should be as per their specifications. The next slide, I'm going to cover some of the key changes for the responsibility of investigators. And keep in mind, it's all about providing flexibility and clarity. So, investigator remain the ultimate responsible for an appropriate supervision of the study team. Flexibility is brought when it comes to trial-related training. Now it should correspond to what is necessary and needed. Also, delegation documentation may not be required for clinical trial-related activities that are performed in accordance with routine critical care. This is key, especially for decentralized clinical trial, when you have healthcare professionals that are not part of the study team, but undertaking some of the activities that are related or key for the clinical trial. Again, more flexibility when it comes to communication with the institutional review board and the independent ethics committees. The next item is important. We all know investigators must comply or implement the protocol and comply with the good clinical practices and the regulatory requirements. So they remain responsible to record all deviation, but for important deviation, they have to explain it and they have to provide the measures they are taking or implementing to prevent these deviations from happening again. You will see this interconnected with the responsibility of the sponsor, because the sponsor will have, in the next slides, you will see that the sponsor will need to define what's an important deviation. Medical care for participant, the investigator, when they are physician or dentist, where applicable, they have the overall responsibility for medical care and medical decision. Now, our other healthcare professional can be involved in that. I think it's not they could have the overall responsibilities, they need to be involved. Sorry for that mistake. The last slide for the investigator responsibilities before we go to the sponsor responsibilities. So informed consent, so the usual, but now the R3 version encourages and promotes a variety of approaches to take advantage of the technologies, especially in communication. So we should use video, interactive to provide the information to the participant, but also more clarification and guidance to how to obtain remote consenting when it's considered and when it's applicable and appropriate. Records, always a key element, like that's the keystone for data integrity, but here it states that it refers to the new section for data governance, where say all of the requirements for computerized systems should address what is required or expected as part of section 4. We go now to the sponsor responsibilities. Just some of the key changes. I will go quickly about these ones. So trial design, sponsor should incorporate quality. This is the quality in the design, the conduct, and the operation of clinical trial, by identifying factors that are critical to quality and implementing mitigation strategies, right? They insist on that. The agreement, nothing new, except that now it's clear that sponsor ensure appropriate oversight of clinical trial related activities, important one, that they outsource to service providers. Again, roles and responsibility should be clearly defined and documented in situation where we have a clinical trial that has more than one sponsor. Sponsor oversight, the next one. As I explained, the investigator for important deviation need to explain the deviation and what they implemented to prevent it from happening again. But it's up to the sponsor to define the criteria that are specific to the trial that would enable to categorize and classify and define what's an important deviation. The other important element or the change is the adoption of a risk proportionate approach to the quality management of the clinical trial. And this is basically the quality that needs to be built in the science, the operation, and the conduct of clinical trial. It's quality into the design here. Monitoring remain a key activity, but more clarity is provided to centralized monitoring. Data and records, more details in that section. Again, there is a reference to the section 4 data governance, but a lot of details are provided to computerized system and what they need to require and comply with. So these are the references. So thank you very much. And then I will leave to Andy to continue with this presentation. And thank you again.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is give you some feedback on the MHRA consultation for the ICH E6R3 guideline. And then I will mention data governance, but very quickly, because that'll be covered later. But also talk about Appendix C, which is essential records. So The MHRA became a member of ICH following our departure from the EU. And so as a result of that, we were able to do a consultation as an ICH region in the summer last year on the E6 guideline. So in addition to using the Excel spreadsheet for the collection of the detailed comments on the actual guidance, we also took the opportunity to use the portal to ask a series of questions, and they were based on the documents that Leigh talked about, which is the reflection paper and the concept paper. We also asked about the implementation of the ICH GCP Principles, just section 2, into the UK legislation, as we'd previously consulted on this as part of an update to the UK clinical trial regulations. So about 56 respondents completed the questionnaire. They uploaded an Excel spreadsheet and pressed the submit button. And 34 tried to do that, but just answered 1 or 2 questions and didn't like the difficult bit of the Excel spreadsheet, perhaps. And some of them were clearly practicing, and some were duplications as well. So I've got some graphs in a minute that will show the people who completed it and pressed the button with a spreadsheet and those that were incomplete, just to show you the difference between those. The completed responses, they submitted just short of 950 comments in the Excel spreadsheets altogether, which when I last looked was the second highest of an ICH region. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad in terms of how many. It certainly took a long time to plough through them all just recently. So in terms of who responded, we had quite a broad range of UK respondents. So we had non-commercial organisations such as universities, NHS hospitals and charities. We had commercial pharmaceutical companies and CROs, and then a number of individuals involved in clinical trials, including in investigators as well. So question 1, in relation to whether respondents thought that the update advanced the risk of a proportionate approach in the design and conduct of clinical trials, there was a large majority in agreement with no disagreement, so that's 87%. Question 2, whether the update encouraged organisations involved in trials to use a risk-based approach and focus on the protection of trial participants and the reliability of the results. Again, over 82% agreed with that, and disagreement was very low. Just to say that it seemed to be the same people who disagreed with everything to this, so you know who you are, I guess. Then question 3, whether the guideline conveyed the need for a collaborative, thoughtful and risk-based approach based on the nature of the clinical trial and how aspects of GCP are applicable. Again, the majority, 83%, agreed, with most of the remaining uncertain. Question 4, whether they agreed or disagreed that compliance with GCP principles can be accomplished using multiple tools and methods. Again, over 82% agreed, so there's little disagreement. There was a little, slightly lower agreement when asked about whether the new section on data governance flexibly addressed the requirements of increased use of new technology, but we're still talking about 75% in agreement, and again, the others are mainly uncertain. A slightly lower majority, down to 67%, in relation to whether the respondents thought that the new section on essential records allowed a more thoughtful and flexible and proportionate approach. And again, this was a move towards being more uncertain. So hopefully the updates that we have based on the comments and the proposed ICH training materials will help those who are uncertain to be a bit more certain about it. And then the lowest majority, but still at 55%, were in agreement that the guideline addressed innovation and complexities in investigator sites, test facilities, and service providers in trial design. And you find that text in the ICH documents. That's where it came from. And again, there was a move to being uncertain, and perhaps this is an area that the expert working group who are updating the guideline can take a look at. And then the last question, number 8, was whether the GCP principles in ICH section 2 can be successfully and proportionately implemented into the UK legislation, and over 71% thought that could be done. I think some of the comments that we received on this indicated that there needs to be some more guidance and training in risk proportionate approaches to get rid of people being risk averse and in implementing adaptations. And I think there's a little bit of a fear that regulators might be inconsistent in how they approach risk proportionate approaches, with one regulator saying that's fine and another one saying not, or even one inspector saying so and another one saying not. So that's something I think regulators will have to work on to make sure that risk proportionate approaches are going to be successful. So overall, from those responses, I think there was a generally positive reception to the updated guideline. So data governance, this is all I'm going to say on this, because there's a separate section where we're going to address a lot of aspects of the changes in the new section 4. And this section has details on the data lifecycle and also on computerized systems. And also there's been new text added to both the sponsor and the investigator sections regarding their responsibilities in terms of data governance. So what I'm going to talk about now is essential documents, which I seem to have been talking about for at least 15 years in various presentations ever since I first saw the most horrendous ETMF ever, where I couldn't find anything. Thankfully, things are changing through time, and I've got a lot better. So what's changed in R3? Well, we've changed some definitions. There's some new detail on the management of records and addressing that new technology has been used. The big change is the simplification of tabulations that used to be in section 8. So we've removed the before, during, and after structure and where the document is located. The purpose section on those old tables has been removed, and that has generally been contained in new text, which gives guidance on why a document is essential. So in terms of the investigator responsibilities, the box is highlighted in orange. You can see that some new text has been added to address the situations when an investigator leaves site or a site closes, in terms of keeping the sponsor updated on who's got the responsibility for the retention of the investigator's essential records. And then we've also removed the duration of the retention relating to 2 years after the last approval of the product in the ICH region, ... what was in there before. And that's just been simplified now to be in accordance with the applicable regulatory requirements, so the national legislation essentially in each region for how long they should be stored, or until the sponsor says you can go ahead and destroy them. In R2, there was emphasis placed on the monitor for checking that all the essential documents were in place and would be retained. This concept is still in there, but it's more about the monitors ensuring that investigators are doing that at their sites. And so there's new text in here in orange that you'll see on the slide, and that relates to the sponsors making arrangements for the retention of their essential records. And this is because of trials are getting more complex. Essential records can be located in many different places before, during, and after the trial. And also there's new text added, you'll see here, in terms of service providers, because they actually can maintain or retain, in some cases, some of the sponsor's essential records. So the sponsor needs to be sure how these records are all got to be managed across all the different parties. And we have seen that this is starting to be done by sponsors in terms of contractual arrangements with service providers or development of TMF plans that set out who's going to keep what, and also internal procedures within an organisation to clarify the roles of different functional areas for the retention of their essential records. And lastly, there's been the same change to the retention time, as I mentioned, for the investigator section. So what's changed in the glossary? Well, you may hear me notice I'm talking about records rather than documents that was in R2. And this is because the definition has changed to acknowledge that we're not just talking about traditional documents that you might see on a piece of paper, but there's also the data and its associated metadata that are also essential records and need to be retained. And many processes in clinical trials are now done in computerized systems. So you have clinical trial management systems that might be documenting monitoring activities, and particularly in terms of risk-based monitoring. There's lots of computerized systems doing dashboards, etc., or working out when the regulatory green light's been met, or SAE case processing, etc. So documents aren't really applicable. They're actually records in a database or activities in workflows that need to be retained. So it didn't make sense to keep the word document, because that implies it can be like printed to a PDF or even to paper and filed in a paper file, which it would make no sense to do that for some of these things. So the language now suits the modern clinical trial with its increased technology. And so because of this change, the glossary terms of documentation, source data, and source documents have been looked at and combined into a new term called source records that contains a lot of the R2 text, but is updated to reflect the new technologies. So records are being generated in a clinical trial. You can't help but generate them in a trial. We all know how many bits of paper trials generate and databases, etc. But that's because you're following the protocol, you're following trial-specific processes, and you're following quality system procedures that generate their own quality records, for example, forms and QC records, etc. And also from communication. So lots of emails, lots and lots of emails, letters, minutes from lots and lots of meetings between individuals within the different organizations and between organizations involved in the trial. So these are all the records that need to be retained. So the need for why essential records should be retained has not changed in R3. They provide the information on what's happened in the trial and during its design and conduct and reporting. And these can then be evaluated for compliance without having to have complete reliance on speaking to people who are actually involved in the trial. And that's because the individuals who did the trial might not be there when it comes to be inspected. So just trusting it was done properly without any records to demonstrate that's not going to be sufficient. If you took that to the extreme, we could just accept the statement in the CSR that the trial was conducted in accordance with GCP, and that will be enough. But obviously that isn't enough. We want to see the evidence that it was, and that means looking at documentation and, where we can, speak to the individuals in the trial. So it has been also emphasised in the new update about the impact of conducting a trial in a proportionate way. So if you look at your trial and decide what's important and what processes you're going to follow and how that links to the guidance in Annex 1, and you make decisions on adaptations, etc. So you do your trial proportionately, then the trial master file or your collection of essential records is going to end up being proportionate, because you're not going to be doing activities that you felt weren't necessary in terms of risk for that trial. So a proportionate trial results in a proportionate level of documentation. So there's also some updates on the management of essential records, and this involves version control and approval of records. It also addresses that many essential records aren't necessarily trial-specific, so software validation records, for example, might not be related to a trial-specific build, but the software itself, and they need to be retained as they also tell part of the story of the compliance of the trial. There's also new text about being a thoughtful approach of where documents are located, and it now talks about access rather than having copies of documents, because electronic records can be shared electronically, and so that any party involved in the trial can have the access to the information they need to take their responsibilities. But doing this also acknowledges that there's a risk to patient confidentiality in relation to investigator sites. And lastly, there's more detail on service providers. So in terms of storage, generally those who generate the record should store that. And also the prescriptive locations of where documents are stored is not necessarily true. We can use portals to share documents and then use audit trails to demonstrate the access and then provide documentation to be filed at the end of the trial. The guidance is updated that some documents may not be in a primary eTMF system. They may actually be held in repositories elsewhere. And then lastly, the storage of the records has been addressed in terms of the essentiality of them, and there's guidance on that, and looking at whether the record actually permits and contributes to the evaluation of the trial. I mentioned the tables before, so what I wanted to do is ask some questions about the tables. So the documents in those tables, they're there in every trial. Table 1 is for documents that would expect to be available in every trial. Table 2 is those that, if they are produced, then they will be retained. So in terms of a vote in the audience and also a vote online on this aspect, we just wanted to know what you thought about the changes to the tables. Do you prefer the R2 way with the tables as they are? Do you prefer the new way, the proposed way with the shortened tables and more guidance on what makes the document essential? Or do you prefer to have no tables whatsoever? So hands up for no tables. No takers for that? Hands up for the proposed way. About quarter. Hands up for the old way then, in current R2. I don't think a lot of you can't make your mind up whether which you want. So what have we got on the screen? %92 for the new way. Well, that's encouraging then, because it means that the people online are liking the new way. I have been at conferences with TMF colleagues who supported no tables, and the TMF reference model group meeting recently supported 54% voted for no tables. So that's encouraging that there's a liking of the new approach. So thanks very much for that.
I've got to say that I prefer not to use Excel. So I'm going to stick up for your participants with the survey, because just because you're an Excel defunct person doesn't make you a bad person. I'm a word wizard, but I can only do one thing at a time. So the other thing I wanted to say is we were at a meeting where there was a lot of internal chatter about the glossary, and I nerd out for a good glossary. How great is that? So I know that some people wanted it, some people didn't, but I think it's very helpful. So I'm going to stick up for the glossary. Okay, I'm going to take us home with Annex 2. Don't worry. I know it feels like the wild, wild west with Annex 2. I don't love uncertainty either, but we're going to hear a lot about what's going on out there. And then very soon you will see some draft guidances. So the ICH E6R3 Annex 2, it is intended to address the growing interest in clinical trials using various operational approaches and data sources and additional GCP considerations. You'll hear during the course of 3 days about decentralized elements, where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at locations other than the traditional clinical trial sites. So that's like patient homes or mobile trial units, local clinics, so their primary provider, and data collection may remotely be collected. You'll hear about some pragmatic elements. Those reflect trials that closely resemble routine clinical practices. And you'll hear about some real world data sources. There's conferences dedicated to just that third bullet. For example, those are use of registries. We see that sometimes in oncology files, electronic health records, hospital data, pharmacy and medical claim data or wearables. So here are the timelines, for Annex 2. Really, we should see a draft form for public consultation soonish in the next calendar year. And it's likely that the final ICH E6R3 Annex 2 release date will probably fall somewhere in 2025. And before we finish up for today, I wanted to just talk about the summary for all of our speakers. So the first bullet here, ICH E6R3 is really attempting to fully satisfy the regulatory demands of the latest clinical trial innovations. Much thought was put into the transparency and the expert working groups and interagency collaboration and collaborations with you, stakeholders, including public comments and multiple, I can say documents for this, it doesn't need to be records. The second bullet was to discuss, to focus on the appropriate quality by design, proportionate, and risk-based approach. If you don't leave these next 3 days hearing that at least a dozen times, then we haven't done our job. It's looking at the conduct of clinical trials and address the complexity of clinical trials in the current global regulatory climate. And lastly, does require training. And specifically, we did talk about, Dr. Abid did talk about the investigator and sponsor responsibilities, including a new Section 4 on data governance and a data lifecycle and computerized systems. And you did hear Andy Fisher talk about record management. So there'll be some training cases for you to share with your group. And again, over the next 3 days, you should hear more about all of these certain sections, certainly data, Section 4, data governance, and the like. Okay, so this concludes our panel. I'll bring it back over to my colleague, Dr. Ayalew.
Thank you, Leigh. Thank you very much, Leigh, Hocine, and Andy. Please join me to applaud, actually, the three presenters who did an amazing job. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we were able to finish, actually, the presentation on time, and perhaps a couple of minutes I can give back to you. And there is a coffee break, and we'll be returning back to the room 10:20, and where we will be discussing technology in clinical trials and DHT. Please come back exactly at 10:20. Thank you very much.